On 12th of August 1907, at a rented stone villa overlooking the Bay of Cannes, Consuelo Vanderbilt adjusted a pair of pearl-button gloves before stepping into the loggia. The gesture looked effortless, almost ornamental, yet even in the Riviera warmth she performed it with the precision drilled into her since childhood posture, lessons at the breakers. A diary fragment preserved in the Marlborough papers noted her habit plainly. "I prepare my gloves before anything else. They compose me." That morning's light spilled through striped awnings, touching the marble balustrade, the lemon trees, and the polished brass of the French windows. In the distance, a sailboat cut a clean line across the water, a freedom she could watch but rarely claim. The Paris Herald would later report she was traveling quietly with intimate friends. Quietly meant unseen, intimate meant safe. She lifted her hand to smooth a fingertip along the glove's seam. Grace held, choice waited. In the late summer of 1907, shortly after her formal separation from the Duke of Marlborough, Consuelo Vanderbilt arrived discreetly at a villa in Cap d'Antibes. The property sat behind high walls covered in climbing jasmine, invisible from the coastal road where motor cars occasionally passed. Society journals in London reported only that she had withdrawn from Blenheim for a period of repose, a phrase calibrated to suggest health rather than scandal. The New York Herald's Paris edition added that she was visiting friends on the Mediterranean coast, careful to omit names, addresses, or any detail that might enable the photograph hunters who prowled the Riviera's fashionable corners. The villa belonged to a sympathetic American couple, the Hammonds, documented in Riviera social registers from 1905 onward, whose wealth came from Chicago railroads and whose discretion came from their own complicated entanglements with European society. They offered refuge, not publicity. Their household staff had been trained in the particular silence required by guests who needed to disappear. Consuelo carried a leather writing case monogrammed CSM, preserved today in the Metropolitan Museum's Costume Archive. The initials stood for Consuelo Spencer Churchill Marlborough, though she had begun to wonder which parts of that name still belonged to her. Inside were drafts of letters to her mother, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, now remarried and championing women's suffrage with the same strategic force she had once applied to marrying her daughter into the British aristocracy. One surviving line, written in Consuelo's precise hand on cream stationery, reads simply, "I hope to think clearly here." She removed her gloves slowly before setting the case on a carved walnut desk positioned near the window. The motion, fingers working backward from each pearl button, then the careful pull at each fingertip, had been practiced 10,000 times. It was a gesture of control in a life where little felt hers. Outside, the Mediterranean stretched endless and blue, indifferent to titles, indifferent to expectations. A gardener moved among the lemon trees with pruning shears, the metallic snip carrying through the warm air. The villa's interior was simpler than Blenheim's staterooms: whitewashed walls, terracotta floors, furniture chosen for comfort rather than lineage. No ancestral portraits watched from the walls. No footmen stood at attention. The absence of ceremony felt both liberating and disorienting, like stepping into a room where all the familiar furniture had been removed. She opened the writing case and withdrew a fountain pen, unscrewing the cap with the same deliberate care she applied to everything. Her hands, freed from gloves, looked paler than she remembered, the skin almost translucent in the southern light. She had spent 28 years learning to move as if she weighed nothing, to speak as if every word had been rehearsed, to smile as if the performance cost her nothing at all. Now, in this borrowed villa with its jasmine-scented air and its merciful anonymity, she wondered what it might feel like to simply exist without an audience. Even refuge required etiquette. By late November 1888, at the age of 12, Consuelo was already being shaped for the world she never chose. At the breakers in Newport, the Vanderbilt family's summer residence, designed by Richard Morris Hunt and completed that same year, her governess, Miss Alice Hickman, maintained detailed records of daily instruction. These ledgers, still held in the archives of the Preservation Society of Newport County, documented a curriculum designed to manufacture grace. Posture lessons conducted while balancing books, French dictation copied in perfect script, mandatory afternoon walks along the cliff walk where her deportment could be observed and corrected. The Breakers itself was a statement of ambition rendered in Indiana limestone and Italian marble. 70 rooms spread across 4 floors, each one a calculated demonstration of Vanderbilt wealth and cultural refinement. But for Consuelo, the mansion's grandeur was simply the architecture of her childhood, as ordinary to her as a tenement apartment might be to another girl her age. She knew which servants cleaned which rooms, which staircases caught the afternoon light, which corners of the music room offered the best acoustics for her violin practice. Her days rotated with mechanical precision. Morning lessons began at 8. Mathematics, literature, history. Languages followed, French with Mademoiselle Emilie Rupert, a Parisian instructor whose diction was so precise it made every syllable feel like a small correction. After lunch came accomplishments, watercolor painting, pianoforte, the aforementioned violin, then the afternoon walk, regardless of weather, during which Miss Hickman assessed her carriage, her stride length, the angle of her chin. Glove training began early, treated as seriously as the multiplication tables. Consuelo learned to pull each finger into place without wrinkling the kid leather, to fasten buttons in sequence from wrist to forearm, to remove them with equal precision. The process had to appear effortless. Any struggle, any visible effort, suggested inadequate breeding. Gloves are an extension of comportment, Miss Hickman noted in her ledger for December 1888. They are a small exercise in dignity. What Miss Hickman's records did not capture was the sensation of those early lessons, the way kid leather felt against growing fingers, the slight resistance of each button, the knowledge that this ritual, like all the others, was being permanently installed in her muscle memory. Years later, Consuelo would adjust her gloves without thinking, a reflex as automatic as breathing. The training had worked precisely as intended. Beyond the structured curriculum, there were less official lessons absorbed through observation. She learned that her grandfather, Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, had died the wealthiest man in America, but remained unwelcome in certain drawing rooms because his fortune came from railroads rather than inheritance. She learned that her mother's determination to secure social position for the family was not vanity, but strategy, a campaign waged across continents with the precision of military planning. She learned that being American meant being simultaneously privileged and insufficient, rich beyond measure, but genealogically suspect. The cliff walk stretched for 3.5 miles along Newport's eastern shore, offering views of the Atlantic that could be admired but never quite enjoyed. On those mandatory walks, Consuelo practiced keeping her shoulders level, her gait measured, her expression pleasantly neutral. Other families' daughters walked the same path, similarly supervised, similarly trained. They exchanged carefully modulated greetings, their voices carrying just far enough to be polite, but not far enough to suggest vulgarity. Those early rituals set the palette of her adult life, refinement as structure, silence as skill. Every gesture had the correct form. Every silence had a strategic purpose. In the Riviera's warm terraces years later, she would recognize the same expectations wearing a softer climate, the same performance requirements wrapped in Mediterranean light. The architecture might change, but the blueprints remained identical. Privilege felt expansive, but its boundaries were drawn early and drawn in permanent ink. In 1893, at age 17, Consuelo attended her first formal London season under the exacting supervision of Alva, who documented each appearance in letters now held at the Vanderbilt family papers at the New York Historical Society. These letters, written to Alva's sister and confidant, describe the social machinery with remarkable candor. Ball invitations sorted by prestige, presentation gowns analyzed for competitive advantage, alliances calculated with the precision of a chess grandmaster evaluating positions on the board. The London season, operated according to rules as rigid as any legal code. It ran from April through August, centered on a series of ritualized events: the drawing room presentations at St. James's Palace, the Royal Ascot races, the Henley Regatta, dozens of carefully orchestrated balls and garden parties. American heiresses, particularly those without titles, occupied a peculiar position in this hierarchy, welcomed for their fortunes, scrutinized for their manners, evaluated as potential solutions to aristocratic financial difficulties. Alva understood the machinery perfectly. Her letters detail meetings with Lady Paget, an American-born society strategist who specialized in brokering transatlantic marriages. They discuss which families were actively seeking American capital, which titles came with manageable estates versus crushing debt, which young dukes and earls might be persuaded toward matrimony despite their personal preferences. One letter from May 1893 notes, "The Marlborough situation presents opportunities, though the Duchess mother will require careful handling." For Consuelo, the season meant a succession of performances. Each ball required a different gown, worth of Paris for the most prestigious events, carefully selected to suggest both wealth and restraint. Each presentation demanded perfect execution of the curtsy, that peculiarly theatrical gesture of obeisance that could be ruined by a trembling knee or a poorly timed rise. Each garden party required the ability to make conversation that was pleasant without being memorable, gracious without revealing anything genuine. The physical demands were considerable. Corsets laced tight enough to create the fashionable silhouette made breathing difficult and eating nearly impossible. Shoes dyed to match each gown often caused blisters that had to be concealed and endured. Dance cards filled with names of young men she barely knew, each dance lasting just long enough for preliminary evaluation, not long enough for actual connection. She learned to smile through exhaustion, to make her third curtsy of the evening look as fresh as her first, to pretend that being examined like a prize mare at auction felt perfectly natural. Between events, there were fittings, consultations, strategy sessions. Alva critiqued every performance: Consuelo's posture during the waltz, her choice of conversational topics, the way she held her fan. Each detail mattered because each detail signaled breeding, training, suitability. American fortunes might open doors, but only impeccable performance could secure positions. The season's social calendar was published in advance, distributed among the families who mattered. Invitations arrived on heavy cardstock, engraved with coats of arms and phrased in the third person. Acceptances had to be sent within 24 hours, written in the same formal language, free of personality or enthusiasm. The entire system operated as a kind of choreography where missteps were noticed, remembered, and held against one's family for generations. Consuelo kept a private diary during that first season, fragments of which survive in family archives. One entry from June 1893 reads, "Danced with 7 different men tonight. Cannot remember a single conversation." Another, undated but clearly from the same period, "Mother says I'm being too particular. I am not being particular at all. I am simply waiting to feel something besides duty." When she stepped into her Riviera villa 14 years later, in August 1907, she paused at the threshold and looked down at the tiled floor. Blue and white Portuguese tiles arranged in geometric patterns, Mediterranean, unceremonious, utterly unlike the parquet and marble she had walked across during that first London season. No one was watching. No one was evaluating. No one was calculating her value based on the angle of her chin or the precision of her small talk. She unfastened a glove, button by button, and let it drop onto a wooden chair. She was not sure if she did it for comfort or rebellion, only that no one was there to tell her it was wrong. Silence, newly found, unsettled her more than applause ever had. In 1894, a year before her arranged marriage to the Duke of Marlborough, Consuelo was sent on what Alva termed finishing circuits, a series of educational placements designed to polish away any remaining traces of American informality. The year was carefully orchestrated. 3 months in Paris refining her French accent with Madame de Breteuil, whose salon on the Avenue Montaigne attracted the sort of aristocratic clients who could afford to be particular about their children's diction. 2 months in London with the English governess Miss Sarah Beers, whose specialty was deportment and whose notes, preserved in the Marlborough archives, emphasized the mechanics of presentation. Head lifted but not proud, shoulders low but not slouched, hands never fidgeting, gloves are always immaculate. These lessons were not simple refinements but tools for diplomatic maneuvering. A future duchess was expected to converse fluently in French, the language of international sophistication. She needed to navigate Italian for opera attendance and German for the inevitable encounters with European royalty at state occasions. Her posture had to communicate breeding without arrogance, confidence without aggression. Every skill carried an unspoken objective: to maintain alliances, charm ambassadors, and avoid the kinds of social missteps that could embarrass a ducal family whose lineage stretched back centuries. Miss Beers maintained detailed records of Consuelo's progress. Weekly reports noted improvements: posture during seated conversation markedly better, curtsy depth now consistent, voice modulation appropriate for drawing room versus ballroom contexts. The language was clinical, as if Consuelo were a mechanism being calibrated, rather than a young woman being prepared for a life she had not chosen. The Paris months introduced Consuelo to the particular art of salon conversation, that peculiar form of controlled spontaneity where it had to appear effortless, knowledge had to seem natural rather than studied, and opinions had to align with prevailing aristocratic sentiment while suggesting independent thought. Madame de Breteuil hosted weekly gatherings where young women practiced these skills under the guise of cultural education. Poets were invited to read, musicians to perform, but the real curriculum was learning to participate in conversation without dominating it, to be noticed without being memorable, to charm without revealing too much personality. Consuelo discovered she was good at it. The same qualities that made her a successful student: attention to detail, ability to read subtle social cues, willingness to perform rather than rebel, served her well in Madame de Breteuil's salon. She could discuss Victor Hugo's poetry, express appropriate admiration for Wagner, offer thoughtful observations about the Impressionist exhibitions without betraying any opinions that might be considered radical or unsuitable. But she also noticed the pattern. Every skill she mastered was a skill of concealment. The better she became at conversation, the less of herself she revealed. The more polished her French, the easier it became to hide behind linguistic precision. She was learning to be perfectly articulate while saying nothing at all. In the Riviera villa decades later, Consuelo would practice these same exercises each morning on the terrace, sitting upright in a wicker chair, spine perfectly aligned, hands relaxed in her lap. The difference was context. At 18, these exercises had purpose. They were preparing her for the performance of her life. At 40, they were simply habits so deeply ingrained that abandoning them felt impossible. But there, on the Mediterranean terrace, with the sea breeze softening the discipline, she sometimes allowed her shoulders to drop slightly, her hands to rest in a less formal arrangement. Small rebellions, noticed by no one. Old lessons followed her, even where expectations could not. The morning routine recorded in Consuelo's own memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, published in 1953, reveals patterns established during those finishing years and maintained across decades. Light breakfast taken in the morning room, correspondence before 10 o'clock, French reading for an hour, piano practice until noon. This schedule was portable, transferable from the breakers to Blenheim Palace, to the discreet villas where she spent her post-separation summers after 1907. But in the Mediterranean, her letters shifted in tone, where her correspondence from Blenheim tended toward formal updates, guest lists, renovation plans, the obligatory descriptions of country house parties. Her Riviera letters contained different observations. One fragment sent to her friend Lady Evelyn Cecil in August 1908 reads, "The light is kinder here. I can think of nothing but the sea, and for once that seems sufficient." She wrote on cream stationery embossed with a simple C, ordered from a Paris stationer on the Rue de la Paix, who supplied American expatriates and European aristocrats who preferred discretion to ostentation. The paper was expensive but unmarked by titles or addresses, anonymous luxury. As she wrote, seated at a small desk positioned to catch the morning light, she occasionally adjusted her gloves. In the Riviera heat, she wore lighter ones, silk instead of kid, cream instead of white, chosen for practicality rather than protocol. The ritual of glove adjustment had become so automatic that she rarely noticed herself doing it. But here, their purpose was different. Instead of maintaining the boundary between herself and the world, they shielded her hands from the sun. Instead of signaling social position, they simply protected skin from freckling, a concern her mother had drummed into her during childhood. A lady's hands reveal everything, Alva had instructed. They must be protected, maintained, and presented with the same care as her reputation. Nearby, the villa's gardener, an Italian man named Giuseppe, whose family had worked the property for 3 generations, arranged fresh jasmine on a stone shelf outside the salon windows. The scent drifted through the open shutters, mingling with ink and sea salt and the faint perfume of the writing paper. Giuseppe moved with practiced efficiency, placing each stem precisely, creating arrangements that looked spontaneous but resulted from decades of practiced skill. Consuelo watched him work sometimes, drawn by the paradox of his position. He was serving her, yet in this specific task, arranging flowers for aesthetic effect, he possessed expertise she would never have. She had been taught to appreciate flower arrangements, to comment appropriately on their beauty, to recognize the seasonal appropriateness of various blooms, but she had never been taught to create them herself. That was work, and work was definitionally beneath her station. The contradiction troubled her in ways she struggled to articulate. She had been educated to appreciate art without creating it, to discuss literature without writing it, to admire music without composing it. Her entire training had been consumptive rather than productive, designed to make her a sophisticated vessel for other people's creativity, never a source of creation herself. On the terrace, with morning sun warming the terracotta tiles and Mediterranean light making everything look softer than it was, these thoughts arrived without invitation. She tried to discipline them, to redirect her attention to the letter she was writing, but they persisted. What was she, exactly? A duchess by marriage, an heiress by birth, a woman by accident of gender. But beyond these categorical facts, who was she? The question felt dangerous, almost improper. Women of her class were not supposed to interrogate their own identities. They were supposed to inhabit their roles gracefully, to find fulfillment in proper performance, to derive meaning from meeting expectations. Beauty persisted, but its meaning quietly changed when no one was watching. During her years at Blenheim, from her marriage in November 1895 through her formal separation in 1906, Consuelo mastered the rituals documented in Edith Wharton's contemporaneous essays and in the guidebooks produced for American women entering European aristocracy. These included strategic seating arrangements at formal dinners where precedence was determined by rank and had to be observed without error, measured curtsies at court where the depth and duration communicated precise degrees of respect, and the calibrated timing of social visits where arriving too early suggested eagerness and arriving too late suggested disrespect. Blenheim Palace itself was both residence and performance space, a Baroque masterpiece designed by John Vanbrugh in the early 18th century, presented to John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, as a reward for military victories. The palace contained 187 rooms spread across 7 acres of floor space. State apartments included the Great Hall with its 67-foot-high ceiling painted by James Thornhill, the long library stretching nearly 200 feet, and the saloon where portraits of 11 generations of Marlboroughs watched visitors with varying degrees of painted judgment. Consuelo's performance was well regarded. Society columns from the period often remarked on her unfailing dignity, her gracious demeanor, her ability to preside over elaborate dinners and country house parties with apparent ease. The Morning Post in December 1899 described her as the embodiment of aristocratic grace, equally at home discussing politics with cabinet ministers and literature with visiting artists. What these public accounts could not see were the mechanisms behind the grace. Each formal dinner required hours of preparation, reviewing guest lists with the household steward, consulting with the chef about dietary restrictions and preferences, planning table decorations that would impress without suggesting extravagance, arranging seating to facilitate useful conversations while avoiding potential conflicts. Each country house party demanded similar orchestration, coordinating hunting schedules, organizing entertainment, managing the complex social dynamics of guests who might be political rivals, romantic entanglements, or business competitors forced into temporary proximity. But private letters tell another story. In a note to Lady Paget dated June 1905, preserved in the Paget papers at the British Library, Consuelo wrote, "I feel I'm moving through rooms I do not belong to, performing a role I never auditioned for. The applause is real, but it is not meant for me. It is meant for the character I have learned to play." The metaphor of performance appears repeatedly in her private writing from this period. She described herself as an actress whose role required constant vigilance because any break in character would reveal the mechanism beneath the illusion. She compared Blenheim to a theater where backstage, the family quarters, the private correspondence, the moments alone in her dressing room offered no respite because even there she had to maintain readiness for the next public scene. In the Riviera summers post-1907, after the separation had freed her from Blenheim's daily demands, she found herself entering different kinds of rooms. Villa salons were smaller, less formal. Shaded pergolas required no precedence arrangements. Terraced gardens had no portraits watching. Yet even there, she unconsciously performed old rituals, offering tea with the wrist angle she had practiced for years, pouring at precisely the correct height to avoid splashing, placing the cup on the saucer with the handle at exactly 4 o'clock. Years of training made repetition automatic, even when the stakes had vanished. She noticed herself doing it one afternoon in August 1909, sitting in a wicker chair on a Cap Martin terrace, pouring tea for a friend who had known her since childhood. The friend laughed and said, "You don't have to be a duchess here, you know." Consuelo smiled but said nothing. The truth was more complicated. She didn't know how to not be a duchess. The performance had become her default mode, and unlearning it felt as impossible as unlearning how to breathe. Even freedom carried the imprint of duty, visible in every practiced gesture. The villa at Cap Martin that Consuelo visited in August 1909 belonged to an American friend, Harriet Lethbridge, whose husband had made a fortune in textile manufacturing before his death in 1905. The property's guest books, now digitized as part of the Archives Départementales des Alpes-Maritimes collection, show Consuelo's stay spanning 3 weeks, arrival on August 12th, departure on September 2nd. The entries are simple, just names and dates, but they provide documentary evidence of these quiet retreats that society pages mentioned only in the vaguest terms. During this stay, Consuelo resumed language study with a private tutor from Nice, a Madame Clémentine Orsini, documented through receipts filed in the same archives. The receipts show payment for 18 hours of Italian instruction and conversation practice at a rate of 12 francs per hour, a luxury but one Consuelo could afford with the allowance settled in her separation agreement. Madame Orsini left no formal teaching notes, but a letter she wrote to a colleague in October 1909 survives in a private collection. In it, she described her famous student. The American Duchess possesses remarkable precision in French and progresses quickly in Italian. Her accent is nearly flawless. She studies with the focus of someone who finds relief in structure. She never speaks of Blenheim, though once she mentioned how differently light falls in English versus Mediterranean architecture. The lessons took place in a loggia of pale stone, positioned to catch morning breezes from the sea. The space was furnished simply: a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of Italian literature, ranging from Dante to contemporary novelists. Windows opened onto a garden where cicadas produced their constant summer rhythm, that particular Mediterranean sound that has no equivalent in English or French gardens. Consuelo studied in white muslin dresses chosen for the climate, her hair arranged more simply than Blenheim protocol would have allowed. A silk fan rested beside her notebooks, not a decorative accessory but a practical tool against August heat. The fan was Japanese, painted with cranes in flight, a gift from a friend whose name is lost to history. Each afternoon, after the language lessons concluded and the day's heat made outdoor activity unpleasant, she practiced piano in the villa's music room. This was not performance practice, but personal discipline, another habit from childhood that had become psychological necessity. The villa's piano was a Pleyel upright, well-maintained but modest compared to the Steinway concert grands at Blenheim. The acoustics were different too. The music room was smaller, simpler, with plain walls that reflected sound plainly, rather than the ornate plasterwork that added richness to Blenheim's music. She worked through Chopin preludes, Schubert impromptus, the Mozart sonatas she had learned as a girl in Newport. Each note emerged clearly in the afternoon silence, each chord resolving according to the composer's intentions, each phrase structured by centuries-old rules of harmony. There was comfort in this, music that followed patterns, problems that had correct solutions, beauty that emerged from technical precision. But she was aware, sometimes painfully, of the difference between technical correctness and emotional expression. She could play these pieces accurately. Her years of instruction had ensured that, but she rarely felt them. The music emerged from her fingers as a demonstration of skill rather than an expression of feeling. It was performance without interiority, the same pattern that had structured her entire life. Once, in mid-August, a window shutter swung open during her practice, disrupted by a sudden Mediterranean breeze. Sunlight flooded across the piano keys, momentarily blinding her. She stopped playing and sat quietly, hands resting in her lap, feeling the warmth on her skin. The cicadas continued their rhythmic song. Somewhere in the garden, Giuseppe was pruning rosemary, releasing its sharp fragrance into the afternoon. For perhaps 3 minutes, Consuelo did nothing. She did not correct her posture, did not resume playing, did not move to close the shutter. She simply sat in the unstructured moment, experiencing it without purpose. Then, automatically, she adjusted her gloves, though she was not wearing any. Her hands made the motion in empty air, muscle memory performing its ritual even in the absence of its object. She noticed what she was doing and laughed, a small sound that echoed strangely in the simple room. The Riviera softened sound, but not expectation, not yet. In July 1910, society columns announced her presence in the south of France, using the indirect language reserved for those whose privacy was both requested and respected. The Tatler mentioned a distinguished American duchess among the visitors to the Riviera, without providing a name. Le Figaro's social page noted that Madame la Duchesse de M was séjournant tranquillement on the coast, the careful truncation and euphemism preserving discretion. This was not accidental. The British and French press had developed an informal code for reporting on separated or divorced aristocrats, particularly women who had not caused scandal through their own misconduct. Consuelo had not run away with a lover, had not created public scenes, had not violated the essential rule. She had maintained appearances even as she extracted herself from an unbearable situation. In return, the press granted her what passed for privacy, mentions without details, acknowledgement without exposure. The villa she occupied that summer was in Beaulieu-sur-Mer, another property belonging to American friends. It was smaller than previous residences, just 8 rooms, but positioned on a quiet hillside above the harbor. The garden descended in terraces planted with lavender, rosemary, and the olive trees that gave the Mediterranean landscape its characteristic silver-green shimmer in summer light. Within this modest sanctuary, she began hosting small gatherings, not the elaborate entertainments required at Blenheim, but intimate affairs of 8 or 10 guests. These were readings from French poets, quiet afternoon teas served on the lower terrace, evenings where lanterns glowed against whitewashed walls, and conversation drifted from literature to politics, to the peculiar beauty of the coast's morning light. The guests were carefully selected. Other Americans living quietly in Europe, a few sympathetic French aristocrats who valued discretion, artists and writers whose social position freed them from the stricter rules governing titled families. One regular attendee was the American painter John Singer Sargent, who kept a studio in nearby Nice. His diary from August 1910 mentions delightful evening at C's Villa. Good conversation, better wine, best company. What made these gatherings different was their lack of agenda. At Blenheim, every dinner had a strategic purpose: strengthening political alliances, maintaining social position, facilitating her husband's ambitions. Guests were selected for usefulness, conversation was directed toward productive ends, and success was measured by outcomes rather than enjoyment. Here, gatherings had no purpose beyond themselves. Conversation followed interest rather than strategy. Silences were permitted, even welcomed. If the talk turned to poetry, it was because someone genuinely wanted to discuss Verlaine, not because discussing Verlaine would impress useful witnesses. Consuelo discovered she was good at this kind of hosting, too, perhaps better than she had been at the strategic entertainments of her Duchess years. Released from the pressure of constant calculation, she found herself more genuinely present, more able to listen rather than perform listening, more willing to express actual opinions rather than calibrated versions designed for diplomatic effect. Her gloves, once essential armor for every social encounter, now rested loosely beside her teacup, removed and forgotten. She wore them less often in this climate, and when she did, they were practical cotton rather than formal kid leather. The symbolic weight had lifted, though the habit of reaching for them remained. One evening in mid-August, after guests had departed and the villa had grown quiet except for cicadas and distant surf, she sat alone on the terrace and realized something that felt simultaneously obvious and revolutionary. She was occupying space without performing. The evening had required no rehearsal, no strategic planning, no calibration of persona to the audience. She had simply been present, participating in conversation because it interested her, laughing when something amused her, offering opinions because she held them rather than because they would be diplomatically useful. The realization carried a strange sadness beneath its liberation. For years, decades, really, her entire existence had been performance. She had learned to move through the world as if every moment were being observed and judged, because in her life at Blenheim, every moment had been observed and judged. The weight of that constant scrutiny had shaped her so thoroughly that even now, free from it, she sometimes could not tell where performance ended and authentic experience began. But here, on this terrace, where no one was watching, where the stakes were merely whether the evening had been pleasant rather than whether it had advanced strategic objectives, she could feel something shifting, not transformation, that would take years, but the first recognition that transformation might be possible. She was learning to occupy space without performance, though the learning came slowly, imperfectly, with frequent returns to old patterns. Consuelo's marriage contract, signed on November 6, 1895, and preserved in the Marlborough family papers at Blenheim Palace, detailed financial arrangements of extraordinary complexity and scale. The primary settlement involved $2.5 million in railroad stock, shares in the New York Central, the primary source of Vanderbilt wealth, transferred from William Kissam Vanderbilt to the 9th Duke of Marlborough. Additional provisions included an annual income of $100,000 for the Duke's personal use and separate maintenance funds for Consuelo herself, though these were considerably smaller and contingent on her continued residence at Blenheim. The contract ran to 14 pages of legal language, each clause negotiated by lawyers representing families with competing interests. The Vanderbilts wanted assurance that their daughter's personal funds would remain under some degree of her control. The Marlboroughs wanted maximum access to American capital to maintain Blenheim, and support a lifestyle that their own declining agricultural revenues could no longer sustain. Both families wanted absolute discretion. The specific financial details were never to be publicly disclosed. What the contract could not specify was the human cost of this transaction. Consuelo herself, in her memoir written decades later, described the marriage plainly. It was arranged with the same careful attention to detail that my mother applied to all her projects. I was her most ambitious project, and she achieved exactly what she intended. The wedding took place on November 6, 1895, at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue in New York. Contemporary accounts describe a spectacle of calculated grandeur. The church decorated with thousands of orchids and roses. The bride's dress designed by Worth of Paris. 60 policemen stationed outside to control the crowds. The ceremony was attended by hundreds. The reception at the Vanderbilt Mansion on Fifth Avenue and 52nd Street hosted hundreds more. Society columns called it the wedding of the decade, comparing it to European royal marriages in scale and significance. Consuelo's own recollection was simpler and more devastating. She wrote, "I spent the morning crying, then composed myself for the ceremony. My mother had achieved her goal. I had achieved nothing, because I had never been asked what I wanted to achieve." The marriage produced 2 sons, John Spencer Churchill, Marquis of Blandford, born in 1897, and Lord Ivor Spencer Churchill, born in 1898. These births fulfilled the essential dynastic requirement. They secured the succession, ensured the continuation of the Marlborough line. Consuelo performed her biological duty with the same competence she brought to all her Duchess responsibilities. But the marriage itself was, by most accounts, including Consuelo's own, emotionally barren. The Duke was described by contemporaries as cold, autocratic, and primarily interested in restoration projects at Blenheim and the social status his title conferred. Consuelo was beautiful, accomplished, and capable of performing the Duchess role flawlessly. But these qualities did not translate to marital affection. They were business partners in an enterprise neither had particularly wanted. Bound by legal documents and social expectations, neither could escape without scandal. By 1906, after 11 years of marriage, the strain had become unsustainable. The separation, confirmed by legal documents filed in London's ecclesiastical courts, was handled with the discretion expected of aristocratic families. Public statements emphasized mutual respect and shared commitment to their son's welfare. Private letters told different stories of incompatibility, emotional coldness, and the grinding burden of maintaining appearances in an irrevocably broken partnership. The separation agreement positioned Consuelo between identities. She remained Duchess by title, American by birth and inclination, woman in liminal space between a life she had been forced to live and a life she might choose for herself. She retained custody arrangements for her sons during specific months, received financial settlements that ensured her independence, and gained the freedom to live where and how she preferred, within the continuing constraints of propriety. Her Riviera retreats, beginning in 1907, offered quiet space to navigate these consequences. The villa terraces became stages for a different kind of negotiation, not with lawyers or family members or society's judgment, but with herself. What did she want, freed from the immediate pressure of others' expectations? Who was she, stripped of the Duchess performance she had perfected over 11 years? These were not questions she could answer quickly or completely, but the Mediterranean summers provided space to begin asking them, to sit with uncertainty, to experiment with versions of herself that were neither the dutiful daughter Alva had shaped nor the perfect Duchess Blenheim had required. The gloves that symbolized that perfection spent more time in drawers than on her hands now, their pearl buttons catching afternoon light through villa windows. Strategy had shaped her marriage. Reflection, slowly and imperfectly, shaped its aftermath. After her separation, Consuelo formed a close relationship with Jacques Balsan, a French aviator and industrial heir whose family fortune derived from textile manufacturing in the Loire Valley. Their correspondence, portions of which survive in private family archives, reveals a connection built on mutual respect and gentle affection, rather than the dramatic passion society gossips preferred to imagine. Balsan was 41 when they met in 1906, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, accomplished in both business and the relatively new field of aviation. He had piloted balloons and early aircraft, winning several competitive races. He collected art, particularly Impressionist paintings, and maintained residences in Paris and at his family chateau, Le Suet, near the village of Châteauroux. He was, in several respects, the opposite of the Duke of Marlborough, warm where the Duke was cold, genuinely interested in Consuelo as a person rather than as a performing asset, and financially independent enough that her American fortune held no particular allure. A note from Balsan to Consuelo, dated August the 1908 and sent to her villa in Cannes, demonstrates the tone of their early correspondence. I hope the sea gives you peace. The gardens here are beautiful, but less so without your presence to appreciate them. The roses seem to ask where you have gone. The sentiment is genuine but restrained, expressing affection without demanding response, offering companionship without imposing obligation. Society speculated, subtly, cautiously, but the Riviera's geography and culture protected them. Unlike England, where aristocratic society formed a relatively small and tightly networked community, the French Riviera hosted a more cosmopolitan mix: European nobility, American expatriates, artists, exiles, and new money families seeking sun and relative anonymity. The French press, moreover, operated under different conventions than their British counterparts, generally respecting requests for privacy from aristocrats who maintained proper discretion. The villas themselves were built for privacy. Properties in Cap d'Antibes, Beaulieu-sur-Mer, and Roquebrune featured high walls covered in climbing plants, private docks accessed through gardens, gates staffed by servants trained to deny photographers and uninvited visitors. Inside these protected spaces, Consuelo and Balsan could walk together along cypress-lined paths, take morning tea on shaded terraces, spend evenings in conversation unobserved by the machinery of social surveillance that operated so efficiently in London. Their walks were recorded only in the memories of friends, a few of whom later provided anecdotal evidence in their own memoirs. One American acquaintance recalled seeing them at a small restaurant in Antibes, speaking quietly in French, laughing occasionally, just two people enjoying each other's company without the burden of spectacle. The observation was meant kindly, emphasizing the normalcy of their interaction, the relief of not being performers in a society drama. What developed between them was partnership rather than romance in the Victorian sense, though romance in the Victorian sense had largely been a literary invention anyway, bearing little relationship to how most aristocratic marriages actually functioned. Consuelo had experienced the reality of strategic marriage, where affection was optional and duty was everything. With Balsan, she discovered something different: companionship based on shared interests, conversation that ranged freely across topics, silences that felt comfortable rather than awkward. He taught her about aviation, explaining the mechanics of flight with genuine enthusiasm. She shared her knowledge of art and architecture, developed during years of managing Blenheim's collections and overseeing restoration projects. They discussed politics. He was liberal in French terms, supportive of democratic reforms, and skeptical of aristocratic privilege, positions that resonated with Consuelo's own evolving views. They read together, comparing French and English translations of classical texts, arguing good-naturedly about interpretation. The relationship was, in its way, revolutionary precisely because it was so ordinary. Two adults in their 40s, both financially independent, choosing each other's company based on genuine compatibility, rather than family pressure, social strategy, or economic necessity. This was not how aristocratic partnerships were supposed to form. But then Consuelo had already broken the expected pattern by separating from her duke, and Balsan had broken it by remaining unmarried past 40, despite family pressure to produce heirs. Their relationship existed in a peculiar legal and social limbo. Consuelo remained technically married to the Duke of Marlborough. The separation was legal, but not a divorce, which would require either an act of parliament or papal annulment, both difficult to obtain. She could not remarry without scandal and social exile, but she could maintain a quiet companionship, especially if conducted with appropriate discretion on foreign soil. The Riviera enabled this careful balance. In Mediterranean villas, away from London's watchful society and New York's social arbiters, they could live adjacent lives that occasionally intersected without causing scandal. He might visit her villa for lunch. She might attend a small dinner at his rented house. They were seen together, but not constantly, not in ways that suggested impropriety, at least not impropriety provable enough to generate consequences. In this carefully maintained ambiguity, something genuine flourished. Not a fairy tale romance, but something perhaps more valuable: mutual respect, shared intelligence, the comfort of being known rather than performed for. Secrecy became less a shield than a shared language, a way of protecting something fragile and real from the machinery that destroyed anything it could not categorize and control. By the early summer of 1913, Consuelo and Balsan were frequently documented as guests at Villa Maryland in Cap Ferrat through visitor ledgers and social correspondence referenced in art historian Mary Bloom's research on Riviera society. Villa Maryland belonged to the American Railroad heiress Florence Gould, whose hospitality extended to a carefully selected group of American expatriates, French aristocrats, and discreet political exiles who valued privacy and sophisticated conversation over social climbing. The villa's guest books from this period, preserved in private archives, show Consuelo and Balsan attending the same gatherings on multiple occasions between June and September 1913. They were never listed as arriving together. Propriety required maintained fiction of separate social calendars, but they appeared at the same intimate dinners, the same afternoon garden parties, the same musical evenings where chamber groups performed on terraces overlooking the Mediterranean. These gatherings functioned as a kind of rehearsal space for the partnership Consuelo and Balsan would eventually formalize through marriage in 1921, after her annulment from the Duke of Marlborough was finally secured through ecclesiastical channels. But in the years leading to World War I, each summer villa encounter allowed them to experiment with a life not predetermined by dynasty or duty. The social composition of these Villa Maryland gatherings reveals the alternative aristocracy forming on the Riviera, people who had stepped outside conventional paths by choice, necessity, or scandal. There were Americans who had married European titles and later separated, like Consuelo. There were French aristocrats who had chosen careers in business or arts rather than traditional estate management. There were British younger sons who would never inherit but had developed independent expertise in architecture, antiquities, or finance. There were artists and writers whose talent granted them social access, despite questionable lineage. What united this group was not wealth, though most were wealthy, but a certain complicated relationship with the social systems that had formed them. They were inside enough to understand the machinery, outside enough to critique it, and secure enough to risk association with others in similar positions. They could discuss politics frankly, acknowledge the coming decline of aristocratic power, question the systems they had benefited from, all without feeling they were betraying their class because they were, in various ways, already half outside it. In this context, Consuelo and Balsan's relationship appeared less scandalous than it might have in London. They were simply two among many who had chosen companionship over convention, who valued personal compatibility over strategic alliance, who were building lives according to their own preferences rather than family demands. Consuelo's presentation within this social set also shifted subtly. At Blenheim, she had been the Duchess. Her title came first. Her personality existed only as it served ducal functions. Here, among Riviera friends, she was increasingly just Consuelo, an intelligent, thoughtful woman with art knowledge, linguistic skills, and hard-won understanding of how power operated beneath social pleasantries. The gloves she once wore meticulously, the physical symbols of her Duchess performance, appeared less frequently. In the Mediterranean warmth, Simpler dress was not only acceptable but expected. She wore loose muslin dresses, wide-brimmed hats, minimal jewelry. The elaborate constructed elegance required at Blenheim gave way to something more authentic, taste rather than display, comfort rather than costume. Balsan, observing this gradual transformation, once remarked to a friend, the comment preserved in a letter now held privately, "She is remembering who she was before they turned her into a duchess. It is like watching someone emerge from deep water, learning to breathe air again." The metaphor was apt. Consuelo was learning to inhabit herself rather than a role, to express preferences rather than perform them, to make choices based on genuine desire rather than strategic calculation. The process was slow, incomplete, often frustrated by the habits of decades, but the Mediterranean summers provided space for the work, for the small experiments in authenticity that would eventually reshape her understanding of who she could be. When war erupted in August 1914, this carefully constructed alternative world shattered. The Riviera emptied as European aristocrats returned to their estates. Americans fled for neutral territories, and villas were shuttered or converted to medical facilities. Consuelo and Balsan, like everyone in their circle, found themselves pulled back into national identities, family obligations, the historical forces that refused to respect personal preferences. But the Summers had accomplished something irreversible. They had demonstrated that other ways of living were possible, that partnership could be based on genuine compatibility. That identity was not entirely fixed by birth and marriage. When Consuelo and Balsan eventually married in 1921, they were formalizing what the Riviera had already proven, that they chose each other, not as strategy, but as genuine preference. In private, the ceremony had softened into choice, a transformation that began on Mediterranean terraces where the rules were different, the watchers were fewer, and two people could discover whether they actually liked each other when performance was no longer mandatory. When war reached Europe in August 1914, the carefully maintained world of Riviera discretion collapsed almost overnight. Society pages, which had spent years describing distinguished visitors in careful euphemism, shifted abruptly to lists of casualties, war bond drives, and reports from the front. Villa Maryland closed, its staff dismissed, its gardens left to grow wild. The villa in Bolu, where Consuelo had hosted poetry readings, was requisitioned for military use. The quiet house in Cap d'Antibes, where she had first sought refuge in 1907, stood empty, its shutters locked, its terraces accumulating fallen leaves. The Paris Herald documented a withdrawal of distinguished visitors from the coast, though the phrase understated the speed and finality of the evacuation. Americans caught in Europe scrambled for passage on increasingly scarce Atlantic ships. French aristocrats returned to family estates to manage war demands on agricultural production. British families recalled their sons from Mediterranean leisure to military service. Consuelo herself left for neutral territories and soon shifted to relief work, documented in the records of the American Ambulance Hospital in Paris. The hospital, established by American expatriates in the first months of the war, provided medical care for wounded French soldiers. Consuelo's participation was recorded in administrative documents. She funded an entire ward, visited regularly, and organized supply drives among wealthy Americans still in France. This was not the Duchess performance she had perfected at Blenheim. Relief work was actual labor, organizing logistics, navigating bureaucracies, managing personalities under stress. It required competence rather than grace, effectiveness rather than elegance. She discovered she was good at it, perhaps better than she had been at the ceremonial functions that had consumed her Blenheim years. A letter to Balsan from December 1914, preserved in family papers, reveals her thinking, "I spend my days in hospital wards that smell of carbolic and blood. It is nothing like Blenheim, nothing like the villa terraces. But I feel more useful than I ever felt hosting dinners for people I did not particularly like to advance, causes I did not particularly believe in." The villas where she had rehearsed a quieter self fell silent. Staff were dismissed or conscripted. Terraces grew over with bougainvillea that no one pruned. Boats remained moored and unused, their hulls slowly accumulating barnacles. The gardens that had been so carefully maintained, jasmine and lavender and roses arranged for aesthetic effect, reverted to Mediterranean wildness. Yet those summers had altered Consuelo's understanding of what was possible. In her memoir, written decades later, she reflected, "I found, at last, moments of my own. Not freedom exactly. I remained bound by all the usual constraints of class and gender and social position. But within those constraints, I discovered small spaces where I could breathe, think, choose." The entry, dated retrospectively to the period between 1907 and 1914, refers unmistakably to those Mediterranean years. The villas themselves were gone, repurposed, or abandoned, but what they had enabled remained. The knowledge that performance was not identical to identity, that the self existed beneath the roles, that choice, however limited, was possible. The gloves she once adjusted as armor became souvenirs, folded into a drawer rather than worn daily. When she eventually moved into her marriage with Balsan, into the Lousseuil Chateau, where they would spend subsequent decades, she brought those gloves with her. They rested in tissue paper in a drawer in her dressing room, occasionally discovered by visitors who recognized them as artifacts from a different life. One such visitor, the American writer Edith Wharton, noted in her diary after a visit in 1923, saw Consuelo's Duchess gloves in a drawer. She showed them to me with a strange expression, not quite nostalgia, not quite relief, perhaps recognition that both those emotions were insufficient to the complexity of what she had lived through. The war changed everything, including the possibility of returning to the Riviera's pre-war discretion. When society eventually reestablished itself on the coast in the 1920s, it was different, louder, faster, less concerned with protocol. The villas that had offered refuge to separated duchesses and their discreet companions now hosted jazz musicians, modernist painters, and American writers who found Europe's post-war disillusionment creatively productive. Consuelo and Balsan occasionally visited, staying with friends or renting properties for brief periods. But it was never the same. The world that had enabled their careful courtship, that particular combination of social rigidity and Mediterranean refuge, was gone, replaced by something simultaneously more permissive and less gentle. What began as retreat became recognition of what had been lost in her Duchess years, of what had been discovered in those villa summers, of what remained possible despite the constraints that never fully lifted. In 1953, the year she published The Glitter and the Gold, Consuelo was 76 years old. Jacques Balsan had died 2 years earlier, ending a 30-year marriage that had been, by most accounts including her own, genuinely companionate. She was living primarily in New York, though she maintained connections to Europe and occasionally visited England to see her sons and grandchildren. The memoir she produced was remarkable for several reasons. First, it was unusual for women of her generation and class to write publicly about their lives, particularly about subjects as potentially scandalous as arranged marriage, separation, and the diplomatic maneuvering of transatlantic aristocratic unions. Second, it was written with notable honesty, not complete transparency, which would have been impossible without devastating living family members, but with an acknowledgement of costs and contradictions that earlier autobiographies typically avoided. In describing the Riviera years, Consuelo chose not grandeur, but memory as her frame. The chapter dedicated to this period, brief, just a few pages in a lengthy book, focuses on sensory details rather than social ones. The sound of the mistral through shutters, the fragrance of lemons warming in afternoon sun, the merciful absence of scrutiny. These were not the images readers might have expected from a duchess's memoir. There were no descriptions of elaborate parties, no name-dropping of famous guests, no emphasis on the property's luxury or the social importance of the gatherings held there. Instead, Consuelo described quiet mornings on terraces, the quality of Mediterranean light, the relief of being unnamed in society pages. The passage most frequently quoted by later historians reads, "The villas were simple, at least by the standards I had known. What made them precious was not their elegance, but what they permitted, thinking without performing, existing without justifying, breathing without the constant awareness of being watched." That final phrase, being watched, recurred throughout the memoir. Consuelo understood herself as someone who had spent decades under observation by her mother, by society, by the Marlborough family, by anyone invested in her performance of Duchess duties. The Riviera years represented not escape from observation, but its significant reduction, the difference between constant surveillance and occasional notice. A single photograph survives from her 1909 stay in Cap Martin, now preserved in a private family archive. The image shows Consuelo standing on a terrace, her figure slightly blurred, as if she had moved during the exposure. She wears a white dress, simple and loose, appropriate for warm climate rather than formal presentation. Her head is uncovered, no elaborate hat, no careful hair arrangement. In her hands she holds a small bouquet of jasmine, the flowers already wilting slightly in the heat. What makes the photograph remarkable is not its composition. It is technically imperfect, the focus slightly soft, the framing amateur, but its subject's expression. Consuelo is not performing for the camera. She is not presenting the composed Duchess face that appears in formal portraits. Instead, she looks slightly distracted, as if the photographer had called her name and she had turned mid-thought, her face showing whatever she happened to be feeling in that unguarded moment. The photograph's caption, written in faded ink on the reverse, reads simply, "See Summer." No year, no location specified, no list of companions. The anonymity is deliberate, the discretion intact even in this private documentation. The image now rests in climate-controlled storage, part of a collection rarely accessible to researchers. It has been reproduced in only 2 scholarly publications, both times in black and white despite the original being a sepia tone print. Most people who study Consuelo's life have never seen it. They know her through formal portraits. The wedding photograph showing her in Worth gown and veil, the Blenheim state portraits presenting her in ducal regalia, the later photographs from her Balsan years showing her as a carefully preserved elderly woman. But this single informal image from a Mediterranean summer captures something those formal portraits could not. A version of herself she spent decades trying to access, visible only in moments when the performance requirements were lifted. The archives also preserve one of her gloves from that period, not the elaborate Duchess gloves, but a simple pair of cream silk, worn for sun protection rather than social presentation. They are smaller than expected, sized for hands that modern measurements would classify as petite. The silk has yellowed slightly with age but remains intact. The stitching along the seams shows fine craftsmanship, each stitch precise and even. What these objects reveal, the photograph, the gloves, the brief memoir passages, is not dramatic. Transformation but subtle shift. From woman who could not imagine life without performance to woman who had glimpsed the possibility, experienced it briefly, and carried that knowledge forward even when circumstances required returning to more constrained modes of existence. Her final years were spent quietly, dividing time between New York and Florida, seeing friends, corresponding with family. She died in 1964 at age 87, having outlived most of her generation. Her obituaries emphasized the Duchess's years, the Blenheim restoration work, and the spectacular wedding. The Riviera summers rated barely a mention, but in the photograph she stands unguarded, jasmine in hand, thinking of something beyond the frame. In her life, it took decades to feel that way, to experience moments when the gloves could be set aside, the performance could pause, and the self could simply exist without justification. That knowledge, once gained, never entirely left her. In the climate-controlled drawers of a private archive, accessible only to family members and occasional scholars with special permission, lies a pair of Consuelo Vanderbilt's ivory kid gloves. They date from approximately 1895. crafted by a Paris glovemaker whose workshop on the Rue de la Paix supplied European aristocracy and wealthy Americans. The leather is still supple, preserved through careful storage and occasional treatment with specialized conservation materials. The seams are still perfect, each stitch placed with precision that modern mass production cannot replicate. The pearl buttons still shine, 13 on each glove, running from wrist to mid-forearm in the style fashionable during her early Duchess years. The interior is lined with the finest silk, cream-colored, barely visible unless the gloves are turned inside out, but the fingers are faintly softened, shaped by a woman who wore them flawlessly for years and then, gradually, learned to let them go. They rest there, quietly, preserved like everything else from that era. Beautiful, costly, perfectly made for a purpose that no longer exists, exactly as she once learned to be, until she discovered that being could mean something different, something chosen, something hers.